So today's the last lecture is going to be over the reproductive systems, male and female. It will be the third of three lectures that are part of the final exam. Final exam will cover reproductive systems today, last time's discussion on the urinary system, and before that we had the respiratory system. So those three chapters or those three systems are on the final. That is a non-cumulative, regular final, just another exam. It'll be next Tuesday. Morning session at 10 a.m., the afternoon session at 4:15, regular class time. And you'll just need a Scantron form for that. So the same routine. You'll have a little bit longer, not that you'll need it, it's just a regular exam, but because it is a final exam, there's a little bit longer of a time period that's allotted to it. I think it's an hour and 15 minutes that's officially given to you for the final. Vocabulary will be urea to the end through the pharmacological and medical abbreviations. And don't forget there'll be connection questions on there, right? How are the respiratory, urinary, and reproductive systems connected to other systems? And that's about it. Any thoughts? You also have a lecture quiz that is due on mastering, and you'll have that done. I think I have it for Sunday night, so I wanted to give you enough time to finish that up Sunday night, and then give you Monday and part of Tuesday to review for the final exam. And then once that exam is done, I probably will have final grades posted by sometime Wednesday, I would imagine. Okay. So, any thoughts or questions about the final or anything else business-wise related to the course? Okay. Well, let's get started with the reproductive systems. And I'll start off with sort of just a big general overview, and that is that remember that the reproductive systems are really there to produce the sex cells or the gametes. And in order to produce those gametes, the testes and the ovaries are involved with the process of meiosis. And meiosis is that type of cell division where we have, if you will, cut in half the amount of genetic material. And that is so that when the egg and sperm reunite at fertilization, you restore that normal number of, in the human, 46 chromosomes. And we've seen in the lab that in the male, each cell that begins spermatogenesis is going to create 4 sperm cells. It's a little bit different in the female. Each egg actually only creates 1 egg. So as you go through the process of meiosis, there are some specific things that change the numbers, and we're not going to get into all those details. Remember, too, that sex is determined at the time of fertilization, and that can be seen here in this karyogram. When you look at all the chromosomes, that's called a karyogram, and from it you get a karyotype. And what you can see on this is that there are pairs of chromosomes, and they're ordered from 1 down to 22, and the number 1 chromosome is the biggest chromosome, number 2 is a little bit smaller, all the way down to the smallest 22, and those are, quote, your autosomal chromosomes, your body chromosomes, and then there are the sex chromosomes, sort of their own little set, and here we see an unmatched pair. The X is quite large, the Y is quite small, and because we see the X and the Y, this would be the karyotype of a male. Okay, if it were a female, you would see a matching pair of X chromosomes. So just remember that sex is determined at the time of fertilization, and we can see that by using this tool. What we have here are all the chromosomes. They are either in mitosis at the stage of metaphase. And so remember that in mitosis, the chromosomes have already duplicated themselves. And so you've got this double set of chromosomes. You've got a chromosome on one side, a chromosome on the other side, and we call that one chromosome, but there's actually a copy of it. They've already been replicated during the S phase of the cell cycle. So just a reminder, we've seen this story a little bit in lab, and that is there is a cell within the testis called the spermatogonium, singular, and when puberty begins, then that cell will make another one of itself, normal ove mitosis, and then it will divide a couple different times, and in the end you get 4 genetically different sperm. They are considered haploid, and haploid means, as you know, that they have a single copy of the chromosomes. So haploid sperm That's what the 23 represents. And the regular cell, the spermatogonium, is diploid. And you all saw that on your take-home quiz for the reproductive system. Remember that when the egg and sperm come together, you're restoring their chromosome number. Each the egg and sperm have 23, and upon fertilization now, the zygote, that fertilized egg, will now have 46 chromosomes. So all of you have one set of chromosomes from your mother, one set of chromosomes from your father. Here we're seeing a cartoon representation of an egg. The egg is just in the center, and that little dark circle is the nucleus of the egg. And then remember that in lab I talked about how when the egg is released, ovulation occurs, there's still a bubble of cells around it. When that follicle is released, there's still a set of cells around the egg, and it's through those layers that the sperm must penetrate. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing many, many sperm, hundreds, maybe even thousands of sperm arriving to the egg at nearly the same time. I'll go over it again in a moment, but remember at the very, very tip of the head of the sperm, so there's the sperm's, the little neck mid-piece where the mitochondria are, and then the little flagellum. And at the very, very tip of the head, there's a bag of enzymes called the acrosome. And it's from that acrosome that enzymes are released, and those enzymes are going to help to burrow through those outer layers of the egg. The first sperm that burrows through wins the race, and there's a biochemical change that happens so that a second sperm is not able to penetrate. If a second sperm were to penetrate, that means that that embryo would have 3 sets of chromosomes, right? You'd have 2 sets of dad chromosomes and a set of mom chromosomes from the egg, and that would be a non-viable situation. The egg would not know, or the zygote would not know what to do with 3 sets of chromosomes. So if 2 sperm were to immediately and at the same time, like Olympic stopwatch time, penetrate the egg, then that embryo would not be viable. So within milliseconds of the first sperm penetrating, all the others are excluded through some biochemical changes. And here's actually a colored micrograph, and what you're seeing is the head of the sperm has penetrated through the outer layers, and in this area, I'll put a different color on it. In this area, this would be the neck, right? And that's where all the mitochondria are. And then the flagella is up here at the top. Now remember that all of the mitochondria are in this region, right? All the mitochondria are in the neck or the mid-piece of the sperm. And you may have heard that you have some DNA in your cells that only came from your mother. That's your mitochondrial DNA. You do not receive any mitochondrial DNA from your father. And the reason is all of the dad's mitochondria are kept outside of the egg. They don't penetrate in. So we can do genetic studies traveling back in time, looking at just maternal, mother genetic pathways, because only the mitochondria come through mom lineages. There's no father mitochondrial DNA ever given to a child. And so by doing those kinds of studies, they've actually gone back and seen what they call the mitochondrial Eve. And they've taken all of mankind and looked back historically and discovered, surprisingly, not surprisingly I don't think, that man came from West Africa and we're all related through a mitochondrial Eve, or the first of the humans in the West Africa area. Okay, so let's talk about the reproductive systems. Now what we'll be doing is comparing and contrasting. There'll be a lot of compare and contrast as I go through this. Think about how the male and the female are different and how they are the same. And we'll go through a little bit of the anatomy, but the anatomy is not that difficult. You've seen it. You've already been quizzed on it in your lab exams. So what I really want to focus on here is not so much the anatomy, but just some of the things that make male and female reproductive systems a little bit different from each other. And then next semester in 106, we'll dive in a little bit deeper into the hormones and some of those differences that are really interesting, but there just isn't time for it in this semester. So the reproductive systems, really, their job is to help you, quote, mature, to reach sexual maturity and to have those, quote, secondary sex characteristics that we know occur with puberty. And, of course, they're also producing gametes. So they are producing hormones, and they are producing egg or sperm. And so remember that the testes and the ovaries are actually both endocrine and exocrine, right? They're releasing hormones, that's endocrine, and they're releasing egg or sperm out of the body, so that would be exocrine. the male and female structures are derived from the same cells. So in the early embryo, everyone is female. Female is default. Female is the pattern that every embryo is on, unless there's a Y chromosome and unless male hormones are released, then the female the female structures are inhibited and the male structures are allowed to form. So by default, right, every embryo would be female if it weren't for the Y chromosome. And I showed you back in that karyotype. If you see the Y chromosome, likely that individual will develop male genitalia. Now, because the male and female are derived from the same cells, we're going to talk about homologous structures, homo, same. So homologous structures are like the ovary and the testis, right? Those are homologous structures. They're derived from the same tissues. They end up doing similar things, right? Not the same, but similar, in that they're both the gonads. They both are the egg or sperm producers. And we'll talk about some other homologous structures along the way as well. So here's one of those right now, and that is we have the ovaries and the testes. Plural, testes, testis, singular, is. These are truly the primary sex organs of the human, and we would collectively call them the gonads. In the gonads are where the gametes are produced. Okay, so the egg or the sperm are produced in the gonads. And again, this is producing sex hormones as well as the egg or the sperm. And you've heard of these hormones. The female, the ovary, is primarily producing estrogen and progesterone, and the male is primarily producing a series of hormones called androgens, the most familiar of which is testosterone. Now, men do produce estrogen and progesterone in small amounts. Women do produce testosterone in small amounts. And so these are not exclusive to the sexes, but there's definitely primary or much larger amounts of the estrogen and progesterone in the female. Now, as I've already mentioned, the gonads are the primary sex organs. Everything else is just really fancy plumbing. It's just an opportunity for the egg and the sperm to find each other, and this would happen through a series of ducts, and this will allow for fertilization to occur. As humans, typically fertilization is going to occur internally. Other species of animals on the planet have external fertilization, but we have an internal fertilization system, and when those gametes meet, that's considered coitus or sexual intercourse or copulation. Keep in mind we do have technology now, so there are test tube babies since about 1979. I remember that day, you guys don't, but 1979, I was still a kid, but there was that was when Louise Brown was born. And Louise Brown was the first test tube baby out of England. And they basically just took her mom's egg and her dad's sperm, mixed it in a test tube, and then inserted it. And she was a healthy, normal baby. And then there was a lot of concerns about would she in some way be different because she had been conceived outside of the womb. And it wasn't that long ago, I want to say in the last, I may be aging myself, 5 or 10 years, that she herself, Louise Brown, had her own child. So, and it was normal. So there was no longer a concern that, you know, babies born from test tube situations are in any way different from normally conceived children. So that's how they're kind of the same. Let's talk about how they're different, the systems. And we know that, I guess we're still talking about the same things here. Here we're still talking about the fact that the reproductive systems are dormant until puberty, for the most part. And at puberty, the external sex characteristics that kick in the teenage years become more prominent. That is breast enlargement in females, pubic hair, the deepening of the voice in the male, all of those things that we know that happen. But also, this is when the gametes are going to mature. The sperm are going to start being produced for the very first time. The eggs, remember, they were already produced back in fetal development, but they will begin to go through those series of development at puberty. And all this is corresponding with the production of the sex hormones by the gonads. Now, I can think of one condition where a person never reaches puberty. And I don't have it in the notes, but you may have heard of this condition. And that's called Turner syndrome. Oops. Turner syndrome. And Turner syndrome is a condition in women where they are born with only one X chromosome, and they don't have the two X chromosomes as they normally do. And so these individuals have one of the results of this condition is that they don't go through puberty. They just don't have that process occurring in their body. Now, both systems are producing the gametes, as we said. The numbers, though, are vastly different. Women are going to produce, on average, 1 egg per month, and males are going to produce hundreds of millions of sperm every day. The eggs will have been made way back in development and stored throughout the woman's lifetime, whereas sperm won't start being produced until puberty, are stored for a relatively short time, and then are either ejaculated or resorbed within the epididymis. So there are homologous structures, and there's 4 of them here that I want you to be aware of. And this table tells you them. And so we've got the ovary and the testis. I think we've got that one figured out, right? And then the glands of the penis and the clitoris. Those are also homologous structures. They would have been derived from the same cells and tissues in the early embryo. Those are both the erectile tissues. The scrotum of the male is equivalent to or synonymous with, or homologous is the word we're going to use, with the labia major. Okay, so the large fold of skin surrounding the testes, the scrotum. And then here's one that I've got one picture of today. We've talked about the bulbourethral glands. Remember in the male, the bulbourethral glands were secreting the pre-ejaculatory fluids. They were also called the Cowper glands, right? C-O-W-P-E-R. There is in the female an equivalent gland. It was not in our lab, Amerman lab book or anything like that, but I want you to know about it. And here's that weird word again, vestibular. These are the vestibular glands, and they are in the entryway into the vagina. That's why they're called vestibule, right, or vestibular. So that we've seen that word over and over and over, vestibular, vestibule. So as you, and we'll look at this in a moment, but in the vagina there are these vestibular glands, and they too are producing pre-ejaculatory lubricating fluids. Now, the reproductive organs, the external organs, are present in an area of the body called the perineum. Now, the perineum is a diamond-shaped region between your thighs. Basically, if you were to spread eagle your legs, you would be looking at the perineum. And I'll show you the picture of this in a moment, but the perineum is going to be bordered by the pubic symphysis. Picture that, right? Anteriorly, the pubic symphysis, going down to your 2 ischial tuberosities, and then finally, posteriorly, by the coccyx. So we're going to create this big diamond, the perineum, and then within that diamond, you can split it into 2 triangles, and we'll just kind of have an imaginary line at about the ischial tuberosities, and the anterior triangle that is formed would also be called the urogenital triangle, and that's going to contain the urethra, and in the female, the vaginal orifice. In the male, it's going to go to the base of the penis and to the scrotum. And then the second triangle, the posterior triangle, would be considered the anal triangle, and that would be the same in both sexes. So here's a picture of that diamond. Okay. So female on the left. And so again, we have the pubic symphysis in both, going down to the ischial tuberosities. Remember, that's the bony projection of your ischium that you're sitting on. And then back to the coccyx. Okay, so there's your diamond. And then we can divide this diamond into 2 triangles, anterior and posterior, or urogenital and anal triangles. And as I said before, you can see what's included in each. So you have the vagina and the urethra included in the female. In the male, it goes from the base of the scrotum for the anterior triangle, and then both of the anal triangles are the same. Now, I don't want you to get that word perineum confused with this term, peritoneum. You already know the peritoneum. This was the serous membrane that we talked about back in Lab 1 and early on in the course. Remember we had the pleura, the pericardium, and the peritoneum. So the perineum, right, the triangle between the legs, versus the peritoneum, which I also need to discuss here because remember that the peritoneum is surrounding all of your abdominal pelvic organs. And that's going to include wrapping around a portion of the uterus. And I'll show that picture to you in a moment, but the uterus, which is extending into the abdominal pelvic cavity, will create in the female a couple of pouchy-like structures. Remember, the male and the female abdominal pelvic cavities are essentially the same, right, except for the presence of this uterus in the female. And so the uterus is kind of sticking up into the abdominal pelvic cavity. The peritoneum will be wrapped around it, and it's going to create a couple of what we call pouches, and I'll show these pictures to you in a moment. One pouch will be created between the uterus itself and the bladder. The other pouch between the uterus and the rectum. And as we're still talking about differences and similarities, I've already mentioned to you that the primary sex organs in the female are the ovaries. Everything else would be accessory. Okay, so again, the ovaries are the primary sex organ. Everything else is an accessory organ. Again, pretty much fancy plumbing, and that's going to include the uterine tubes. Remember, the other term for the uterine tubes are the fallopian tubes or the oviduct, along with the uterus, vagina, clitoris, and even mammary glands. Don't forget the mammary glands are part of the female reproductive system. So here's the picture that you know and can label well. So all I'm going to point out are the things that I've just described to you that are different, and that is right here. I am drawing the peritoneum. Okay? So basically what you're seeing is that I'm drawing the outline of the abdominal pelvic cavity. That would be the parietal peritoneum, wouldn't it? And then the organs, right? The organs like the large intestine or the uterus would also have on them the visceral peritoneum. And so now you can see that I've created, and I'll change colors, I've created a dead-end pouch right in here, right, between the bladder and the uterus, and another dead-end pouch here between the rectum and the uterus. And those are the two recesses or pouches that I was discussing just a moment ago. Everything else in here you should be really familiar with. Remember, we can even see on this image the, you can see the ureter coming down, right, kind of in the background. Now, why is the ureter coming down? Oh, that's horribly drawn. But how can you, why does the ureter look to be kind of dim? Where is that ureter that I'm seeing right there? Remember, the ureter, along with the bladder and the kidneys, are retroperitoneal. So the reason that that ureter looks kind of hazy is because it is behind the peritoneum. Okay, so again, you got to kind of think about that. So the ureter is behind the peritoneum, and you're seeing it from inside the abdominal pelvic cavity. So it's not as distinct if it were sitting there in the cavity. I also showed this picture to you in lab. So what's holding the uterus into its proper place within the abdominal pelvic cavity is the broad ligament. The broad ligament is going to help, again, hold the uterus in place, also hold the ovaries in place. And don't forget that the ovary is attached to the uterus through the ovarian ligament. I think I mentioned in lab that ligaments back in bone world, I told you, were bone-to-bone connectors. But to be more complete, ligaments connect structure to structure. So here we have the ovary being connected to the uterus through a, quote, ligament. Also described to you in lab in the process of oogenesis, right? So oogenesis, the production of eggs, begins in early development, and in the cortex of the ovary. You can picture the cortex just like in the kidney or in the brain. The cortex would be the outer layer of the ovary. When you slice into it, you would find thousands of ovarian follicles. And basically what a follicle is, it's an egg, the oocyte or the ovum, the egg, lots of words for that. So egg, ovum, and oocyte, all same thing. that egg is now going to be surrounded by some helper cells or some follicular or follicle cells. And I always think of those as like being bubble wrap around a very precious thing. So you've got this egg surrounded by bubble wrap cells called follicle cells. And you can think of them as nursing or supportive cells. And then once puberty begins, oogenesis kicks up again. So what happens is that the eggs are formed way back in fetal development and then go into a state of hibernation. And they do nothing all the way through birth and through the early years until puberty. And then once puberty begins, then some of those primordial early eggs are sort of, quote, chosen or are woken up, and they begin to form larger follicles, of which one every month will be released from the ovary. So this whole process is oogenesis. And what we're going to form is we're going to go from a primary oocyte to a secondary oocyte. And I'm not going to quiz you on that, but I know you'll see that some of that language in the Amerman book or in your textbook. But we're moving through this series of development, and I'm not going to ask you to differentiate all these different stages. Now, as I've said, before birth, the whole process of oogenesis has already started, and it starts with cells called oogonia. In the male, and I'll say it again, but I showed you that picture early on, there were spermatogonia, right? They were the early cells that produce the sperm. In the female, the early cells that produce the egg are the oogonia. They are diploid cells, right? They are just regular old cells. They've got 46 chromosomes. They've got everything, right? Or 23 pairs, right? 23 pairs or 46 chromosomes. And you could consider these germ cells. Remember, germ cells are cells that haven't yet completely identified themselves, and they still have a development to finish. And so these oogonia could be considered germ cells. And they stop early in meiosis. So they begin the process of making the egg, and then they go into this, like I said, like a state of hibernation. And at birth, a woman in her ovaries would have somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million of these primordial follicles. Okay, so that's the maximum number of eggs that a woman would ever have. The thing is that that number continues to drop. Okay, so although there may be 1.5 to 2 million at birth, by the time the person gets to puberty, the number drops, and then it continues to drop throughout the lifespan until menopause, when basically there are no eggs left. How many eggs will a woman actually, though, release through ovulation in her lifetime? We're starting off with 1.5 to 2 million, and I'm telling you the numbers are dropping off. But how many do we actually need? How many eggs will you release in your lifetime, ladies? Approximately. I'm just going to say approximately, let's say from age 10 to age 50, just to keep it easy for numbers. So 40 years of releasing eggs and about 13 cycles per month, per year, right? But every 28 days, average cycle, that's 13 times per year. So you're looking at around 480, 500, just 500 for easy numbers to remember. Okay, so at the max, about 500 ovulations and 500 eggs being released. Now, like I said, there's this decreasing in the number of these follicles, and the term for that decrease is atresia. Okay, so atresia is occurring. Atresia is a decrease in the number. They basically get broken down, they regress, or you can think of apoptosis occurring. And these eggs are decreasing in number. So by the time a woman reaches puberty, she only has about 400,000 of these follicles left. That's still way more than she needs, right? Because she's only going to release 500 or so in her lifetime. What kicks this whole thing into gear, and is true in the male as well, is that the hypothalamus starts to produce a hormone called GnRH. So I'm going to have you hold on to some of these hormones. There's about 5 hormones that you've got to keep track of here in this discussion, and this will be new. I didn't mention any of this in the lab. GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now, what does gonad, right? Gonad, either ovary or testis. And what does tropic mean? It was in our vocab. Tropic. Not tropic, but tropic. Influencing. Okay? And in the end, it's an IN telling us that it's a protein. So what is gonadotropin? A hormone that influences the gonads. Okay? Gonadotropin. So gonadotropin releasing hormone is a hormone. It's released by the brain, right? We know that region called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is releasing GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Well, guess where that hormone goes? It's going to influence the gonads, right? But it doesn't go all the way to the gonads. First, it's going to stop by the anterior pituitary. Okay, so you know where the pituitary is, that little ball, P-shaped gland that hangs out and sits in the sella turcica. And the anterior pituitary, when it is woken up by GnRH, is going to release FSH and LH. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, it's a hormone that stimulates follicles, right? And where are the follicles made? In the ovary. Okay, so FSH is going to go from the pituitary gland, go through the bloodstream, and influence the ovaries to stimulate the follicle production. And then there's another hormone also produced by the anterior pituitary called luteinizing hormone, LH. And you've heard the word corpus luteum. So we'll see how this corpus luteum and luteinizing hormone go together. Now these hormones, FSH and LH, are cyclic. It's the cyclic nature of these hormones, up and down nature of these hormones, that produces the cycling of the ovarian and uterine cycles. Okay, so we'll talk about that connection today. Now, that's different than the male. Okay, as a distinction, testosterone is just kind of going full throttle all the time. Whereas in the female, right, you got this cyclic nature of these hormones. So that's another distinction between males and females. In the female, the hormones are cyclic, and the males, the hormones are a little bit more straight on all the time. We're going to see that this FSH and LH hormones are going to dictate what's called the ovarian cycle, the monthly cycling of the ovaries. And let's talk about that, and I'll show you a picture of the ovarian cycle. There are 3 phases of the ovarian cycle. Number 1, follicular phase, when the follicle is being formed. Number 2, ovulation. And then finally, the luteal phase. So I've introduced them there, and let me just tell you a little bit more about them. So here are the 3 phases of the ovarian cycle. Number 1, follicular phase. It sounds like the follicles are being produced, right? Follicular phase. This accounts for the first 13 days. We're going to use 28 days as our average. Okay, so everything I'll be talking about here will be the normal, average, 28-day cycle. You may know people who cycle more frequently, less frequently, or are more irregular, but we're going to use 28 days as a normal, average cycle. Okay, and then in a pathophysiology course, you'll learn about how those cycles can be different and why that could be. So in that follicular phase, it occupies the first 13 days of the 28-day cycle, and during these 13 days, about 20 primordial follicles, those are the little guys in the bubble wrap around the cortex of the ovary, about 20 of those will become, quote, primary follicles. In other words, 20 of them are awoken, are going to start a developmental journey. Of those 20, only 1 typically will win out and become, quote, the mature follicle. That mature follicle will be released on day 14. That is ovulation. So ovulation on day 14 is the release of that follicle from the ovary. And typically this is only 1 follicle per ovary on an every other month, if you will. So 1 ovary is taking the charge 1 month, the next month the other ovary might be the lead ovary. And it's not always alternating perfectly left, right, left, right. There can be 2 lefts and then 2 rights. It's kind of a little bit irregular, but one of the ovaries is taking charge each month, basically, and will ovulate on day 14 of the cycle. Then there's the luteal phase. The luteal phase is the rest of the cycle. It's going to be days 15 through 28. And I'll show you this picture in a moment, but remember that corpus luteum was that yellow body that was formed in the ovary, and that's after ovulation. So the luteal phase is the rest of the ovarian cycle. Now, the corpus luteum, to which this refers, is that bubble wrap, right? That bubble wrap around the cells, and it starts to make hormones. The number one hormone that it's going to produce is progesterone. Okay, so I just want you to write somewhere on this slide, and we'll see it in a picture in a moment, but the corpus luteum is going to make progesterone. Okay. Now, it's going to make that progesterone, oh, there it is, sorry. It's going to make estrogen as well, but progesterone's the big one. It's going to make progesterone, and it's going to release it for about 10 to 13 days. Okay, so it's going to release progesterone for 10 to 13 days. If the egg is not fertilized, then the corpus luteum will regress to become that white body, think corpus albino, but it's called the corpus albicans, the white body, at which point it's no longer producing the hormones. Once those hormones stop being produced, then that tells the uterus to begin menstrual cycle again. Okay, so that's if pregnancy did not occur, if implantation did not occur, then the uterus will begin to slough off again. Now, if fertilization did occur, then the embryo itself is going to produce a hormone called HCG. Oops. HCG, little h for human, CG, human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, HCG. This is the hormone that is used in early pregnancy tests. Okay? So the moment that the egg and sperm come together and the embryo is formed, the embryo itself starts to make this hormone, HCG. And we become very good at detecting minuscule amounts of HCG in a female. And so we can now detect, fertilization very, very early. By using these EPTs, these early pregnancy tests. Now, if there's HCG around, that will also tell the body to maintain the pregnancy. Okay, so I'll tell you more about that in a second. So here's the ovary, and recall that the outer layer of it, this is very simplified, but the outer layer of it would be the cortex, and it's within the cortex that you find all these primordial follicles. These are the follicles that were produced before birth and have been sitting there and waiting for puberty to begin. And remember, there were about 400,000 of them still there at puberty. And about every month, 20 or so of them will be magically awoken. Some books will say more than that, some less, but somewhere around 20. Some books say 50, but some number of these primordial follicles will be randomly chosen, and they will begin to get larger and go through a series of steps, but it's like a race. The one that's ahead keeps going, and the ones that aren't ahead start to fall off, okay? And so it's like a long-distance race, and only one makes it to the end and wins. The other ones kind of fall off and get destroyed. The one that wins the race, right, the one that keeps moving through becomes, as you see this kind of in time, gets bigger and bigger and bigger and becomes this big follicle. Here it's called vesicular follicle. I have that written in the slide somewhere. But other books will just call it the mature follicle. And other books, just to make it confusing, will call it the tertiary follicle. Okay, so there'll be primary, secondary, tertiary. You'll see all three of these words used. You'll see mature, you'll see tertiary, and you'll see vesicular. What they're all referring to is the follicle that won the race and is going to be, on around day 14, ovulated, right, released from the ovary. Notice how much bigger that the egg is getting as it moves through the series, and it also gets surrounded by a bigger bubble wrap, doesn't it? So it gets surrounded by fluid and by more cells. Upon ovulation, you can still see that the egg is surrounded by some of these cells. And those are those cells that you saw the sperm penetrating through in that first or second cartoon that I showed you. The tissue left behind, and I'll use yellow here, because that's all this bubble wrap that's left behind within the ovary will become the corpus luteum. Okay? So if I were to use this slide to describe the phases of the ovary, I'm going to use red here. From here to here, that would be the what? Follicle stage, right? Follicular stage. And then at the moment of release, that is ovulation. And then what did I call the last phase? Luteal, right? The third phase of the ovary. And that is the luteal phase, is where you see this corpus luteum is formed. The corpus luteum, remember again, is this bubble wrap, and this bubble wrap gets bigger, and it starts to produce hormones, right? It is releasing progesterone and estrogen, but progesterone being the primary hormone. And I told you that it only produces those hormones for 10 to 13 days. After that, it poops out and now forms the corpus albicans. Okay, it kind of regresses and forms this little corpus albicans. The corpus albicans no longer produces the hormones. Okay. So let's figure out what those hormones are doing. This is just a recap of oogenesis. So during embryological and fetal development, right? During embryological and fetal development, this is when the oogonium is going to start the process of meiosis, but it gets stopped very, very early, and the cells go into a state of hibernation. And that hibernation stage continues all the way through this pink childhood phase. So nothing's going on. They're just sitting there. Once puberty begins, all the way from puberty until menopause, once a month, right? Every other ovary will kind of start taking turns, and the follicle, right, about 20 of these follicles will form, but only one will make it to be the mature tertiary or vesicular follicle. At ovulation, we release that egg, and then the bubble wrap becomes the corpus luteum. It's interesting, too, that the egg doesn't even bother finishing meiosis until and if it is fertilized. So meiosis doesn't even bother finishing in the egg until or if it is fertilized. So most eggs never finish meiosis, only those that become fertilized. So that's what's going on all the way through, from puberty through menopause. Every month we're cycling through. And then there comes a time when this starts to slow down, and that would be called perimenopause. Around the time of menopause, perimenopause. And perimenopause, the estrogen levels begin to drop. There'll be a slow progression drop of estrogen. And during this period of time, which could last for a number of years, the woman might start experiencing some irregular periods, some skip periods, very light periods. And then there will come a time where it just completely stops. Now, once a woman has stopped having monthly cycles for an entire year, and I guess we have to say this caveat, she stopped for an entire year and is not pregnant, right? Now the person is said to have reached full-blown menopause. Okay, so menopause, a year without cycles and not pregnant. And this is going to kick in somewhere, right? Menopause is going to kick in at 45 to 55, somewhere in that range. That's why I said before 50. I said 10 to 50, right? And once menopause happens, there are no more follicles, right? There's no more hormones being produced. The follicles stop maturing. There's much less estrogen and progesterone being released. The endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus, is no longer growing and sloughing off, so there's no more menstrual periods. But because there's less hormones, right, women after menopause have to consider, do they want to do hormone replacement therapy? Because those reduced hormone levels have some consequences. They have some unpleasant side effects in some women with the hot flashes and things like that, and vaginal dryness and things that they try to take some estrogen after menopause to minimize those symptoms. The problem is we know that breast cancer loves, some, not all, but some forms of breast cancer love estrogen. And so sometimes by women taking estrogen, it's actually fueling or can accelerate a breast cancer unknowingly. And there's still a lot of controversy, right? So women have been dealing with, should I or should I not do replacement therapy? They've been doing that for 20, 30 years, and now all of a sudden the guys are starting to deal with it because now you hear about testosterone levels with guys. Testosterone levels starting to drop off. Should they be supplementing testosterone? And so I think, you know, guys in the next 5 or 10 years are going to find out that there may be some consequences to, some negative consequences to the replacement of testosterone. We'll talk a little bit more about that whole ovarian and uterine cycle in a minute, but let's just finish up with a couple more ideas about the anatomy. So the uterine tubes, you know them also as the fallopian tubes of the oviduct. You know that they're coming out from both sides of the ovary. At the end you have, at both sides of the uterus, and at the end you have the ovary. And it's within the uterine tubes that fertilization occurs. Okay, and I'll show you a different picture of that in a moment. But that's where fertilization occurs, and the embryo will then take about 5 or 6 days to travel down the fallopian tube until it reaches the opening of the uterus. Now, the uterus is not only the site of implantation, that is where the embryo is going to hang out for about 9 months, but it's also going to be protecting that embryo. And so the placenta would form along with the embryo in the uterine wall. And then the uterus during pregnancy will get much thicker, much stronger, much more muscular, and will be important for, I love the word ejecting, right? But during labor, will force the embryo out. And of course, the uterus is also, the lining of it is what is sloughing off each month for menstruation. So there's a number of important functions for the uterus. The wall of the uterus, these are names that aren't going to seem surprising to you. We call them tunics, layers. You know the word tunic. And there are 3 tunics to the uterus. The outside layer is called the perimetrium. Now remember, peri means around, so that makes sense, perimeter. And M-E-T-R as a root tells us womb or uterus. And so perimetry, right? We see the M-E-T-R. Then the myometrium is the thick muscle layer of the uterus. And then finally the inside layer is the endometrium. Remember that the perimetrium is a serous membrane, right? The outer layer of the uterus is that shrink-wrapped layer of the peritoneum. So the perimetrium is a very thin layer, and is continuous with that broad ligament. Remember, the broad ligament is what helped hold the uterus into its proper location. The myometrium, rather insignificant in a pre-pregnant, non-pregnant uterus, but during pregnancy it really gets bigger. There's a lot of hypertrophy, right? And hyperplasia, increasing of number and size of the smooth muscle cells in the uterus during pregnancy. Then there's that inner layer, and that was the endometrium, and that is the layer of the uterus that is going to be involved with menstruation. So let's take a look at the uterus. So the ovary had 3 cycles. Right? What were they again? The first 13 days were when the follicle was forming, that was the follicular phase. On day 14, there was a release, ovulation, and then 15 through 28, we said, were the luteal phase. And that's all hormonally controlled in the ovary. Well, those hormones are also dictating what happens in the uterus. So we still have the same 28-day cycle, but we're going to break it up in different ways. The first 5 days of the uterine, and you'll also hear it called the menstrual cycle, is the bleeding phase. So the actual menstrual phase of the menstrual cycle is the first 5 days, and that is the time during which the endometrium, the inside layer, not all of it, but much of the inside layer of the uterus is sloughing off. Then there's the proliferative phase. That's going to be from days 6 to 14, proliferating, growing, rebuilding. And that's when the endometrium is regrowing. And this is largely under the control of estrogen. And I'll show you that hormone slide in a moment. And then finally, there is the secretory phase. This is the rest of it from days 15 through 28. Now, when was 15 through 28 in the uterus? Sorry, in the ovary? What do we call days 15 through 28 in the ovary. Luteal phase. And the luteum, right, the corpus luteum was releasing what? Progesterone, right? Hormones, right? So the luteal phase of the ovary, the hormones are being released, and those hormones are influencing the uterus during that same time. And this is the time, it says right here, right, that there's a lot of progesterone being produced by the corpus luteum. And what that's doing is it is going to increase the blood flow, the vascularization, the blood flow, and the development of the glands within the uterus. This is going to make the uterus very ripe, if you will, ready for implantation. Because during this secretory phase is when the embryo would arrive to the uterus. So the uterus has to be ready, very prime, lots of blood flow, very vascular, lots of gland secretions, and that helps to adhere the embryo for implantation. Now, I'm kind of describing if there's pregnancy. Now, if there is no fertilization, if the oocyte, if the egg was not fertilized, I told you the corpus luteum will degenerate, right? After 10 or 13 days, it'll regress down to the corpus albicans. The hormones are no longer produced. There was no embryo, it wasn't fertilized, and now the endometrium will go through the sloughing off again as the progesterone levels drop. Okay, so the next menstrual phase will begin. However, if there was pregnancy, right, and if there was implantation, the corpus luteum will still regress, but the embryo is now making HCG. Remember I told you HCG was a hormone made by the embryo and is part of the early pregnancy test scenario. So the corpus luteum maintains the uterus for about 10 to 13 days, and then the embryo itself is producing hormones, telling the uterus, hey, I'm here, don't slough. I need to have a home for the next 9 months. Let's take a look at these hormones. And I think once you see this and break this down, you'll be okay with this. At the top, gonadotropin hormones. These were the hormones made by the by the anterior pituitary. Okay? So the anterior pituitary is producing these gonadotropins, and those two hormones are FSH and LH. Right? I mentioned them in passing before. So follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are made by the anterior pituitary. And all I want you to see is this. There's a big spike in both of those hormones. Where? Just before ovulation. Right? So the day or two before ovulation, there's a big spike in both of these hormones. That's all I want you to see there. There's a cyclic spike. Every 28 days or so, there's a big spike, and that is going to help allow the process of ovulation. Women who are trying to get pregnant will check their LH and FSH levels. And once they spike, then they know they're calling up hubby and saying, come on home, because ovulation is about to occur. And I'll mention it again, but fertilization optimally is going to occur about 2 days before ovulation and a day after ovulation. So that's the primo time for intercourse for fertilization to occur. So that along with that spike in hormones comes a slight spike in body temperature. So women will also check their body temperature as an indication that this ovulation and these hormones are increasing. So that's what's happening where? This is what's happening in the ovary, right? And there's that follicular phase, the ovulation, and the luteal phase mentioned across the bottom. Now, happening at the same time, this is now down in the uterus. And now we're looking at ovarian hormones. So the hormones made by the ovary, they were estrogen and progesterone, and they're now influencing the uterus. And what do we see here? There's the menstrual phase, the first 5 days on the bottom, proliferative phase, days 6 through 14 or so, and then the rest of it being the secretory phase. Here's what I want you to see. Estrogen is really high during the proliferative phase. So as the uterus is rebuilding itself, the estrogen levels are going up. Then, in the secretory phase, remember I told you the corpus luteum was making hormones. And I told you it was making both hormones, but I mentioned a big deal that it's making a lot of progesterone. This big purple peak right here is the progesterone. And you see that it becomes a primary hormone in the secretory phase, and that hormone is coming from the corpus luteum. Okay, there's some estrogen as well, but I always think estrogen beforehand, early E, estrogen early, progesterone post, right, or later, after ovulation as the primary hormone. So early and post, or early and late. Now, this slide I just showed you is what's going on with the hormones. The next slide is what's kind of physically happening in the ovary on the top and on the uterus on the bottom. So on the top, there's ovary. Here's the ovary on the top, uterus on the bottom, same as what we just had on the previous slide. And I wish they had this labeled. The first 14 days, what do we call that? Follicular phase, right? And then on day 14, there was ovulation. And then this was called luteal phase. So during the first 13 days, right, that was days 1 through 13, that's when there was the follicular phase, and we see the follicle is getting bigger until we get to the mature follicle. On day 14, ovulation occurs, and then that bubble wrap around it, remember that bubble wrap becomes the corpus luteum. It hangs around. The corpus luteum is going to hang around and secrete hormones for about 10 to 13 days. And then it will regress to become the corpus albicans. So that's what's happening in the ovary. What's happening in the uterus? Well, the first 5 days, menstrual flow. Then a proliferative phase. And we're building the endometrium back up. That's till about day 14. And then the rest of it's called the secretory phase. And this is when the endometrium becomes more vascular. In other words, more blood supply is going to the endometrium. Now, I told you that the ovary takes how many days to get down to the uterus? Sorry, the embryo. The embryo takes how many days to get down to the uterus? 5 to 6 days. So if fertilization happens up in the fallopian tube around day 14 or day 15, there's going to be 5 or 6 more days before the embryo is going to reach the uterus. And look what's happening during those days. The uterus is getting thicker and more prepared. By the time the embryo would reach the uterus, it has reached its maximum thickness. It is most blood-filled and most vascular and most prepared for implantation. Okay. Now so basically what the body's doing is after ovulation, there's a 5 or 6 day period when the embryo would be coming down the fallopian tube, and by the time the embryo would reach the uterus, it would be primo, ready to implant. The body's going to give that embryo about 5 or 8 days to implant, to set up shop. Okay. Now, if there's an embryo, the embryo is making HCG. And the HCG will tell the uterus, I'm here. The baby's basically proclaiming that it's there, and is going to tell the uterus, don't slough off, maintain the pregnancy. If the egg is not fertilized, then the corpus luteum will just naturally decrease its levels of progesterone, and the corpus albicans then will stop producing, and menstruation begins again, sloughing off of the endometrium. So that's sort of the big idea. Now, what I wish I had was this slide superimposed with this slide. And in your own mind, you might want to do that. So let me go back and do that. That means this, that right here, right before ovulation, there was a spike, wasn't there, in LH and FSH. And here we saw a big spike in estrogen, right? That was estrogen going up. and then it came down, and it went up again, but then progesterone came up and kind of just followed the lining of the uterus. Okay, so there's your progesterone. So just kind of look at those hormone levels and appreciate what's happening hormonally versus the actual organs. So here's just a table of those cycles. So again, in the ovary, follicular phase from 1 to 13, ovulation on day 14, luteal from 15 to 28. In the uterus, the same 28-day cycle, first 5 days menstrual, proliferative from 6 to 14, and then 15 through 28 are secretory. Here are the hormones. So there are 5 hormones that you need to keep track of here in the female. GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, made by the hypothalamus and tells the anterior pituitary to produce FSH and LH. Follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are both made by the anterior pituitary. Follicle-stimulating hormone is telling the ovaries to develop the follicles, and we're going to see that luteinizing hormone is going to peak and help stimulate ovulation. And then the estrogen and the progesterone are made by the ovary, and they're going to influence the uterus to maintain the endometrium and maintain it for potential pregnancy. Remember that progesterone is made by the corpus luteum or the placenta. That's what's important. The progesterone will be made by the corpus luteum for just long enough to keep the uterus ready, and then if there is an embryo, then the embryo will start making its own hormones and tell the uterus, hey, I'm here, don't let go. Last few things about female. The vagina, just a couple more structures here. We know it's a tube-like structure. It's going to be also called the birth canal. It is the copulatory organ, if you will, and is the passageway for menstruation. You shouldn't be surprised that there's a lot of blood flow and a lot of lymphatic flow in the vagina, especially lymphatic, right? Think about it's an area of the body where something could invade, and so there'd be a lot of lymphatic vessels along it. There are 3 layers to the vagina. Mucosa, this is the same layers that were in the vagina has the same layers that were in the ureter. Okay, we've got the mucosa, we've got the muscularis, and then the outer layer, the adventitia. Remember that the vagina is outside of the abdominal pelvic cavity, so it doesn't have a serous membrane around the outside. It has instead an adventitia. Everything that you can see externally in the female is collectively called the vulva, and that's going to include the mons pubis, that is the skin on which most of the pubic hair is found, the labia major, the labia minor. The labia minor, or I should say the clitoris, is going to be located at the anterior region of the labia minor, and the clitoris, I've already mentioned, is homologous with the glans penis. The clitoris also has a glans. The glans of the clitoris is just the tip of the clitoris, and that's specialized nerve cells, just like in the male. And there's also a fold over the clitoris that is similar to the foreskin of the male. Here's the only picture I have that shows the vestibular glands. So you can see they're pointing to little glands sort of right in between the labia major and the labia minor, and those again are similar to or equivalent to the bulbourethral or the Cowper glands. You can see the little prepuce, the little fold over the head of the clitoris, and that is the same as the foreskin, equivalent to the foreskin in the male. Last thing about female is, and we don't hear about them as much anymore, episiotomy. Sometimes during birth, they will cut the wall of the vagina and allow for a larger birth. But we don't do them as much anymore. Now we do more C-sections and kind of avoid the whole thing. But you'll hear about episiotomy sometimes. Lastly, just as a reminder, the breast is a part of the female reproductive system. I'm not really discussing it this semester, but keep in mind there are a lot of lymphatic structures around the breast, and those are specifically the axillary lymph nodes, right? Those axillary lymph nodes. Okay, that's female. Okay, anything at all to discuss. We've got about 10, 12 minutes left for male, and that's all I'll need. And we don't get past the, we won't go into any of the sexually transmitted infections. So don't worry about finishing all this section. I never get past that anyway. So right now I'm just going to go through a few things on the male, focusing not on the anatomy, you already have that down, but just a few things that are perhaps new to you. We know that the primary gonads in the male are the testes. Everything else are the accessory organs, including the ductwork and the tubing, fancy ductwork. That includes the penis, the organ of copulation. We've seen this image before. What I want to highlight, remember there are 3 glands that are going to produce semen: the seminal vesicle, the prostate itself, and don't forget the little Cowper glands, or the bulbourethral glands. The scrotum, again, this is equivalent, if you will, to the labia major, okay, it's homologous in the female. And the scrotum is important in protecting the testes, but also in regulating the temperature. Sperm production cannot occur at body temperature. It must be at a lower temperature than body temperature, or else sperm can't produce. And so the scrotum is going to be responsible for temperature regulation, and the scrotum and the muscles within it are going to tighten, and these muscles are the cremaster muscles. That cremaster muscle was in your list of lab things, and I think I told you to cross it off because it wasn't something we can see on the model necessarily. But I just want you to realize that there is a cremaster muscle that will either tighten or will relax, and that's going to pull the scrotum closer or further away, allow it to be away from. And also the scrotum will thin out. In warmer weather, the scrotum will thin out and make temperature regulation easier, and during cold weather will kind of scrunch up and go closer to the body, trying to warm things up. In this picture, what I think is really cool to think about is that the sperm produced in the testis are going to go up through the spermatic cord, through the vas deferens, and come back up, go behind the bladder, and then we know what happens there. But it's neat that everything goes up back into the body. Now, the spermatic cord contains the testicular artery, contains that series of veins called the papiniform plexus, contains the vas deferens. That's all the spermatic cord, and that spermatic cord must pass through. That spermatic cord must pass through the body. The testes are formed up in the body, up in the abdominal pelvic cavity, and usually before birth, they will descend. And they're going to descend through an opening in the inguinal ligament, okay? And this is a weak spot. This is a problem. And it's possible for a hernia to occur in men. That is, internal organs will find their way through that weak opening in the inguinal ligament. So part of a normal exam in a male is to check for a hernia and have the guy cough while feeling up around that inguinal ligament to see if there's any abdominal structures that have come down through that weakened area. But that usually, this dissension of the testes usually happens before birth, sometimes happens shortly thereafter birth. And if it happens to happen within the first year, they usually have to go up and either give the baby boy some hormones to try to encourage it to descend, or surgically bring them down. Because if they don't come down into the scrotum, there will be damage to sperm production throughout the guy's life. So we've got to have the testes out of the body. Here you can just see in the cadaver the same structures here. The scrotum's been opened up, and you can see the testis. See that spermatic cord going up through the inguinal ligament. It does occur, and I don't know if they both work. The testes, okay, what do we know about the testes? We know that if we cut into the testis, and we saw this in the lab, that there are the seminiferous tubules, and within the seminiferous tubules, that's where the cells that are going to make sperm are located. There are cells, though, outside of the seminiferous tubules called the interstitial spaces, or the interstitial cells, and they were described by a German guy named Leidig. So you hear them called interstitial cells or Leidig cells, and they are the testosterone-producing cells. Okay, I'll show those to you in a second. That testosterone is going to be responsible for the production of secondary sex characteristics in the male and is not produced until puberty. So just structurally, what do we have here? We've got all the seminiferous tubules within the testis. We've seen this. The sperm produced there are going to go off to the epididymis. The epididymis is a storage vessel for the sperm. They also grow up a little bit, mature a little bit, and become better swimmers there. Upon production, they really don't swim very well. So they kind of get pushed off to the epididymis by flow of fluid. Then they mature, and then upon ejaculation, again, it's all tubing, up through the vas deferens. You can also see here the nerve, the papilliform plexus, and the testicular nerve, or testicular artery passing through the spermatic cord. So like I just said, spermatic cord has all of those things I just mentioned going through it. So this is the slide we saw in lab. You are looking at a cross-section through a seminiferous tubule. And there'll be another one over here, and there's another one over here. And around the outside of the seminiferous tubule, there will be cells called spermatogonia. Those are the germ cells of the male. And upon puberty, they will begin to go through meiosis to make the sperm. We've seen that story. Outside of the tubes are cells. There's 3 here, there's be some over here, there'd be some over here. Those are the interstitial or the Leydig cells, and they are the testosterone-producing cells that are going to kick in at puberty. You also saw this, I should go back, this entire process of making sperm from spermatogonium all the way through to sperm, that is spermatogenesis. Okay, so that's a word we know. Spermatogenesis. And then within that, from here to here, just this subset of spermatogenesis, this is called spermiogenesis. And spermiogenesis is detailed on this next slide, where we go from a round spherical cell to what we recognize as a sperm that has a head, a midpiece or a neck, and the tail, or the flagellum. The very tip of the head has the bag of enzymes called the acrosome, and the acrosome is that sac of enzymes that's released upon contact and burrows through the egg. You can also see that all the mitochondria end up in the midpiece, and I showed that to you in the early slide, why the guy's mitochondria don't enter into the embryo. So only the egg has the mitochondria for the embryo. The epididymis is where the sperm are going to go, and they're going to mature there. And there's about another 4 or 5 meters of tubing inside the epididymis. So if you were to cut into the epididymis or cut into the testis, as you've seen in the lab, it's just tube, 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 densely spaced or densely packed tubes. Again, if the sperm are there to mature and they grow up a little bit in the epididymis, if they are released too soon, they will be immature and won't be good for fertilization. So timing is more important than frequency when it comes to getting pregnant. Sperm that are released too quickly, if a guy is ejaculating too often, those sperm are not going to have good motility and won't be very good for fertilization. So timing is more important than frequency for fertilization. Sperm that are not released through ejaculation will simply be resorbed, a fancy way of saying they'll be apoptosed. So they'll be broken down and regenerated or degenerated, not but degenerated in the epididymis. The ductus deferens is also called the vas deferens. It is going to carry the sperm from the epididymis upon ejaculation up through the spermatic cord, up through the inguinal ligament, back around by the bladder, and then into the ejaculatory duct. Remember, the ejaculatory duct is going to merge with the urethra within the prostate, and then along the way, it's going to pick up fluid from the seminal vesicle. And then that sperm, along with the seminal fluids, would be transported out of the body through the urethra. And we know that the urethra in the male is divided into 3 parts: the prostatic urethra that goes through just the prostate, the membranous urethra that travels through that area called the urogenital diaphragm, and then finally the longer region, the penile. And this one is also oftentimes called the spongy urethra because it is surrounded by the corpus spongiosum. Now, there are some accessory glands that are important for sperm production and sperm health, and they are necessary, and we talked about these in lab a little bit, and that is that the vagina is a very acidic location, very low pH, and that's important to prevent bacterial growth within the vagina. However, sperm cannot handle that environment, and so the semen will necessarily be alkaline to help neutralize the acidity of the vagina. The seminal fluids are also going to be the nourishment for the sperm. You know, an egg has a big yolk, right? We know, like an egg yolk, that's nourishment. And a human egg also has a yolk, if you will. Now, a chicken is different, right? A chicken never has contact with the mother, if you will, during development, 19 to 21 days when the chicken's developing. The yolk has to give all the energy for that developing chick, right, for that entire 19, 21 days. In the human, the embryo gets its nourishment for just a few days from the egg, after which the placenta is formed. And then there's a nourishment that comes to the baby through the embryo through the placenta. Sperm have a little tiny, tiny nucleus up in the head. They don't have a yolk sac. They don't have a nourishment supply. So that nourishment for the sperm must be provided through the semen for those 2 or 3 days where the sperm are able to move. So we've got to have nourishment and alkalinity as part of the sperm, part of the semen. And we've seen those 3 glands that produce the semen. I went through these slides with you in lab. So just recall there's the seminal vesicles, and they are producing an alkaline fluid that has energy, fructose, and prostaglandins. The prostaglandins were important for smooth muscle relaxing, and that's going to help open up the cervix to allow the sperm to pass through the cervix into the uterus and into the fallopian tubes. The second gland, the prostate gland itself, is producing some molecules. Things to keep in mind here: citric acid, another energy molecule. Seminal plasmin basically acts as its own antibiotic, and PSA, which is an enzyme that liquefies semen following ejaculation. And then we've already talked about the Cowper glands or the bulbourethral glands in the past as well. They are going to merge in their own little duct into the spongy urethra and provide the pre-ejaculatory fluids. Not only are they providing lubrication for intercourse, but they're also cleansing or clearing the urethra of any urine. Remember, urine can be quite acidic, and sperm don't like acid, so we need to get rid of that acidic urine from the urethra. You've seen the male reproductive system in a slide like this. Again, just imagine you've got the scrotum, and you've got an inguinal ligament right here. So you've got the sperm producing this in the seminiferous tubules, stored in the epididymis, go up through the vas deferens, out through the inguinal ligament as part of the spermatic cord, along the bladder, merge with the seminal vesicle, and come in at the ejaculatory duct. The prostate gland is adding to that, and then the sperm embedded in the seminal fluid are going to leave through the urethra. Last 2 slides. So semen is, actually last slide I should say. Semen is the combination of the sperm with the seminal fluids. The seminal fluids come from the glands we just discussed, and a typical ejaculate is going to have 3 to 5 milliliters. That's about half a teaspoon to a teaspoon, and within it will be between 200 and 500 million sperm. So those are just kind of normal averages: half a teaspoon to a teaspoon per ejaculate, 3 to 5 milliliters, with 200 to 500 million spermatozoa or sperm. It takes about 2 weeks for the production of sperm all the way through to ejaculation. So there's a constantly recycling and a constant reformation of the sperm. And a very active sexual male will actually can have lower sperm count. There's a process here to make sperm, and frequent ejaculation will result in low sperm count potentially. The fluid levels will kind of maintain themselves, but there'll be fewer sperm within the ejaculate. And it's important that there's at least 100 million sperm for fertilization. Guys with less than 100 million sperm per ejaculate are considered low sperm count and can interfere with reproduction. So 100 million, right? It takes 100 million to get the job done. It's pretty amazing that under 100 million is considered low sperm count. So normally 200 to 500, under 100 million, you've got some issues with reproduction. Now, the rest of this, not going to talk about. So we're not talking about any of the reproductive methods or pregnancy or rhythm method. And we don't talk about any of the STDs. Don't talk about lactation or chemical methods, none of this. And I just thought at the very, very end, just jump all the way down to aging of the system. And we can appreciate that. We've already talked about it. In females, there's a menopause. That is, with menopause comes an atrophy of the breasts, sort of a decrease in size. The vaginal wall can become thinner, and that can lead to a lack of lubrication and more difficulty with intercourse. The uterus will shrink, and all of those things are happening with menopause. And that's different from males, where gametes continue to be produced throughout the guy's lifetime. So that brings us to the end. Okay? Is there anything at all, male or female, that I can clarify for you or discuss? Make sure you get your mastering assignment done for reproductive. Those are due at the time of the exam next Tuesday. Now, if you got all 30 points already awarded to you for your mastering points, I'm not going to go back and reevaluate. I hope that you find the mastering assignments helpful and useful as a study tool, but I'm not going to go back and lower or raise your grade. If you did not get all 30 points, I will reevaluate that after the next exam. If you've done more of the mastering assignments, I'll go back and adjust that score up, okay? So I hope that you will do those mastering assignments, that you're finding those helpful. Also, the course evaluation did go out, so please give us some constructive criticism back on the way the course is done. And I will see you all next Tuesday at 10 o'clock for the exam in the morning or 4:15 in the afternoon. It's been a good semester, and I'll see you then.